Now that we started our in-depth look at verbs, one thing that I want to spend some time on is the passive voice, because it's a concept that we're going to come back to repeatedly in subsequent weeks, and because in many ways the passive voice has gotten a bad rap. William Cobbett wrote in March 1797 that the passive voice is something that verbal assassins use. It is the true gossiping, calumniating style. That, what they cannot prove, they may at last throw on public report. So, do all verbal assassins speak in the passive voice? Or are there good rhetorical reasons for using this construction? So passive voice occurs when you flip your direct object to the beginning of the sentence and you put your actual actor, the subject of your sentence, in a prepositional phrase at the end. And you use a be verb construction. So how can I change a passive sentence to an active one? Take the word after by and make that the subject of your sentence, Jadori. Remove your auxiliary, be verb, helping verb, was, is, are, and then make the subject into the object. Jadori made the mistake. So basically you just work backwards through the sentence and take out a couple of words. Why would you use the passive rather than the active voice in this instance? Well, you might want to focus more on the mistake and less on Jadori. The mistake was made by Jadori, rather than, ooh, I know, Jadori, she did it, she made the mistake. Passive and active voice shift our focus to different parts of the sentence. We can always change active to passive voice. Take our direct object, the exam, and make that into our subject, the exam. Take our verb and add a be verb, was finished, and then I'd have to say by us, not by we. The exam was finished by us. Somehow this doesn't sound as good as the mistake was made by Jadori. The exam was finished by us. Why wouldn't you simply say we finished the exam? Some active and passive voice constructions work better than others. Here's some practice. Again, pull up a Word file, get out a piece of paper, take out your advanced grammar notebook, and do this. All 4 sentences. First, is it active or passive? And then transform it to its opposite, using the strategies you saw in the previous 2 slides. So once again, you're going to need to pause this scintillating video. I know, it's hard. You love hearing me talk. Pause it now. Get out your stuff. Start writing. So number 1 is passive. The test was taken. Well, I can simply say 30 students took the test. Number 2 is active voice. They all passed the exam. Or I can bump my direct object up to the beginning. The exam was passed by all. Number 3, passive voice. The first 3 questions were skipped by just one person. And you'll notice when I read it like that, it doesn't sound all that bad. I could also convert it to active voice. Just one person skipped the first 3 questions. And then number 4, John earned the highest score in the class. This is active voice. I can convert it to passive. The highest score in the class was earned by, drum roll please, John. Which would you use if you're actually making this announcement? You are going to call out the kid who got the highest score on the exam. Are you going to use the active voice, or do you kind of like the passive voice drum roll version? So do all verbal assassins speak in the passive voice, or do the rhetorically clever sometimes consider the passive voice as the best way to get across a message and to put emphasis on a certain part of the sentence. Why do we use the passive voice? Sometimes we don't know who did it. The lamp was broken by someone. Someone broke the lamp. As your book says on page 45, maybe you want to make statements in the category of accepted beliefs. The war was won. It could be more direct to use passive voice. Maybe your subject has a lot of modifiers that would separate it from the verb. And so if I use passive voice, I can keep things together. All four of these are really good reasons, non-assassinating language reasons, to use passive voice. Now, are there times when passive voice is a cop-out? When you are trying to be a verbal assassin? Well, yes. You want to use passive voice deliberately. You don't want to be lazy about it. You do not want to be a verbal assassin. You want to be making an impact. For example, in science writing, you kind of have to use passive voice because experimenters are not allowed to put themselves in their lab reports. Here are some examples that you would see in scientific or social science writing. You don't say, I separated the three components. You don't say the experimenter did this. You say the mixture was separated, as if by magic. You don't say, usually we conducted a study. You say the study was conducted with 283 high school seniors. Passive voice is the expectation in science writing. If you're not using passive voice, you're doing it wrong. Here are some excerpts from a report that was conducted for the Georgia Department of Transportation. A bridge collapsed. And I want you to notice how much passive voice is in here. During the investigation, but we're not going to name any investigators, anchors within the collapse area were found to have pulled out. Vacated anchor holes were visually inspected. By whom? We don't know. Epoxy samples from inside the holes were collected. Epoxy was observed to vary in color and consistency. Uncured and wet adhesive components were found. The company that did this inspection and investigation is not putting itself in there, nor is the company calling out whoever dealt with anchors, anchor holes, and this epoxy, these adhesive components that probably should have been consistent and dry. Based on the investigation, it was concluded that the canopy failure was the result of material and installation deficiencies. This is very weak pointing of fingers. It's sort of waving the fingers around in the air saying, yes, there were deficiencies in installation. The primary cause of the collapse was the use of an epoxy anchor adhesive with poor resistance to long-term creep under sustained tensile loading. If we read between the lines, if we look beyond the passive voice, what does this report actually say? Whoever built this bridge used the wrong adhesive. But it isn't stated that way. The rhetorical choices were to use passive voice. And in many senses, this passive voice keeps the blame from going to any one person or group. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we're going to talk about that. Often teachers oppose passive voice or be verbs because you end up telling instead of showing. And they want you to write a beautiful descriptive narrative. So instead of saying she was happy, telling, this is how she felt. They want you to show. She danced through the halls. Her face glowed with pleasure. You'll notice these active intransitive and transitive verbs get across the same message. Okay, this person is happy, she's dancing, she's glowing. So if you're using the passive voice to avoid description, well, you're avoiding something. Because when you're avoiding, you are dealing with the obscure agent. Honestly, this is what the report to the Georgia Department of Transportation does. It doesn't assign action to the company that did the investigation or whoever constructed the bridge. You hear this a lot in politics and public relations. Mistakes were made. Who made these mistakes? Well, we don't want to point fingers. We'll just say mistakes were made. The senators were advised. By whom? Who told them? How were they told? Both of these statements obscure the agent, whoever made the mistakes, whoever advised the senators. Unless you're planning to go into politics or spin as a profession, try not to put obscure agents in your writing. Now, sometimes you want a little passive voice and obscure agents for balance. Journalists often use the passive voice to avoid repeating things or making sentences unduly long. All right, this is a news story from the Houston Chronicle at the end of August. You notice we start with active voice. Who? Here is our agent, the National Hurricane Center in Miami. And here's what they said. There are no watches or warnings in effect. An earlier warning for the Cape Verde Islands has been canceled. Notice that suddenly I've got passive voice and an obscure agent. Do I really need to say has been canceled by the National Hurricane Center in Miami? No, it's a little bit redundant. This is information that I already know. I can assume that if the warning has been canceled, it's probably by these guys in the first sentence. And you'll notice for the rest of the story, we have agents. The storm is centered and is moving. Forecasters expect the storm to continue. Out of 5 sentences, only 1 uses the passive voice. If you are a future journalist, you have to think about when are you going to use the passive voice. You should use it sparingly in cases where restating your agent really is just annoying. So the last thing I want you to do, before you proceed to your quiz is to take these 3 sentences that are all written in passive voice and rewrite them in active voice. You may need to supply an agent. The agent might be obscure. And after you do this, I want you to look at what you've written and think about, are there good reasons why the sentences might be written in passive voice with an obscure agent? So copy down your revisions. Make these active voice. Pause the video if necessary. Do I really have to tell you to pause the video? That's kind of sad. Here are some possible choices. A cat thief burglarized. Someone with a key burglarized. Bill's ex-girlfriend burglarized. But what if you honestly don't know who broke into Bill's apartment? I mean, you could say someone burglarized Bill's apartment. Or maybe you just want to stick with the passive voice. It's more direct, and it's easier to say, Bill's apartment was burglarized. The second example is something that we often do see in news stories. The victim was found. Well, a lot of times we want to know who found the victim. Who do we celebrate? Who's the hero? Was it local deputies? Community volunteers? Was it 12-year-old Bryce Martin? This brave child? This is a sentence where obscuring the agent might actually not be a rhetorically smart move. But what if local detectives are worried as often happens, that the person who found the victim is actually the kidnapper. Maybe they wanted in passive voice. Maybe they want to obscure the agent because in this case, the agent is the number one suspect. Finally, come on, give some props to the people who are finally repairing something. Maintenance crews, the awesome folks from facilities. Don't obscure people who are working hard and doing their jobs. So hopefully you've learned that not all who speak in the passive voice are verbal assassins. There are some good reasons for doing so. The quiz you're going to see for the next class asks you to seriously consider, in a particular rhetorical situation, would the passive voice be the better choice than the active?